The lake spread out like a mirror under the late afternoon sun, its surface shimmering with streaks of gold that danced with the gentle breeze. Birds skimmed the water, dipping down for insects, then lifting effortlessly back into the air. Along the far bank, tall pines stood in solemn ranks, their shadows stretching across the rippling current. The sound of the forest, chirping crickets, distant woodpeckers, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the water, created a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat of nature itself. Into this quiet world arrived a man seeking nothing more than peace. He carried himself with an ease born of long work weeks and the yearning for solitude, his every step toward the cabin filled with the promise of rest. The cabin itself was a modest thing, tucked neatly between two tall oaks, its weathered wood darkened by years of sun and rain. It wasn't flashy or overly large, but that was its charm. Built by his grandfather and passed down through the family, it represented more than property. It was heritage, resilience, and a space untouched by the noise of others. The man ran his hand across the porch railing as though greeting an old friend. Dust motes danced in the air as he pushed open the door, the familiar creak echoing in his chest like a memory. Inside smelled faintly of pine and smoke, with quilts folded neatly over the couch and fishing gear waiting by the corner. Every inch of the cabin carried his family's touch. He set down his small bag, not much more than a change of clothes and a favorite book, then walked to the window overlooking the lake. The view never failed him, it was steady and calming, a reminder that some things remained untouched in a world that often demanded too much. He stood there for several long moments, inhaling deeply as though he could drink in the stillness itself. The water called him, and he answered. Taking his fishing pole from its place, he headed down the narrow path that wound between wildflowers and patches of moss until it opened onto the wooden dock. The dock groaned under his weight, but it held firm, as it had since childhood summers when he'd learned to tie lines and bait hooks under his father's watchful eye. Sitting down at the edge, he let his legs dangle over the water, feeling the cool mist rise with each ripple. Casting his line, he let the quiet take him, the soft plunk of the lure swallowed by the vastness of the lake. Time passed differently out here. Minutes stretched into something more generous, more forgiving. He could feel the stress of the city, the constant ringing of phones, and the press of deadlines slipping off him like heavy coats discarded in spring. Out here, no one demanded anything. No one judged, questioned, or expected. The only rules were those of the water and the woods, patience, respect, and balance. After a while, he reeled in, not because he caught anything but because he didn't need to. He leaned back against the dock's worn boards, gazing at the sky shifting toward orange and pink. This place belonged to him in more ways than paper deeds could explain. It was his family's sweat, his childhood's laughter, his own sanctuary when the world outside grew too loud. He knew there was nothing he owed to anyone out here, no neighbor, no board, no set of artificial rules could touch this peace. Little did he realize, beyond the tree line, footsteps already approached. Soon, this quiet sanctuary would be tested. But for now, he basked in the calm, unaware that the cabin's stillness was about to be disturbed by voices that carried not respect but entitlement. The storm had not yet broken, and in the last rays of daylight, the man let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the weekend would remain untouched by conflict. The evening light had just begun to soften, casting a warm glow on the edges of the cabin's porch when the unexpected sound came, a sharp, insistent knock against the wooden door. It startled him at first, pulling him from the quiet rhythm he had settled into. He set aside his book, the pages still open to a half-read paragraph, and listened for a moment. The forest around the lake was usually so still that any disturbance carried weight, and this knock wasn't the casual rap of a neighbor stopping by to say hello. It carried impatience, even authority, like someone who expected the door to open simply because they demanded it. Rising from his chair, he moved to the door and opened it, prepared for anything from a lost hiker to a delivery gone astray. Instead, there stood the HOA President, a woman known across the community for her sharp tongue and sharper sense of entitlement. Her smile was wide, but it didn't reach her eyes. Behind her, several people loitered, clearly her guests, strangers to him, dressed in summer attire as though they were preparing for a lakeside outing. The group shifted on their feet, whispering and glancing curiously at the cabin as though it were already theirs. "Good evening," the president said, her tone honeyed but edged. "We need access to your cabin for a little gathering. My guests don't have the right keys, and since you're here, it's convenient." Unlock the door for us, will you? For a moment he stood in silence, weighing her words. The request, or rather, the command, landed heavily. This was his space, his family's retreat, not some communal clubhouse to be shared at her whim. He studied her posture, the way she stood with her chin tilted upward, already certain he would comply. The expectation in her voice wasn't surprising, but it was grating all the same. He cleared his throat and answered calmly, "This is private property. My cabin isn't open for use. I'm afraid your guests will need to make other arrangements." His tone was respectful, but firm, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Her expression flickered, just briefly, before she smoothed it back into a mask of politeness. The guests shifted again, whispering louder now, a few chuckling as though the situation amused them. She forced a laugh, brushing off his words as though he hadn't meant them. "Oh, come now," she said lightly, waving a hand as though shooing away a pesky thought. "We're all part of the same community. It's only fair that we share. You wouldn't want to cause an inconvenience, would you?" But he did not waver. His hands rested against the doorframe, his gaze steady. "Fair," he repeated, his voice lower now, carrying more weight. "Fair is respecting ownership. Fair is not assuming access because you want it. My cabin is mine, not the HOA's." The smile slipped, her cheeks tightening, and the warmth drained from her voice. Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, lowering her voice to a hiss meant only for him. "Do you know who you're speaking to? I am the president of this association. You don't want to make an enemy of me. These people are my guests. Open the door." Behind her, one of the guests snorted with laughter, enjoying the spectacle. Another muttered something about how ridiculous it was to argue over a cabin when there was a party waiting to happen. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not from fear, but from the knowledge that this wasn't about convenience, it was about control. She had come here expecting compliance, and the very act of saying no had turned the simple knock into the start of a confrontation. The air seemed to grow heavier, the lake behind him now a silent witness to the standoff at the door. He stood his ground, his refusal steady in his heart. The quiet retreat he had come here to protect was under siege, not by strangers alone, but by the very person who believed her position gave her the right to trespass. What she didn't know was that this would not end in her favor, no matter how much authority she thought she held. The silence that followed her demand was thick enough to cut. The man held her gaze, his steady eyes meeting hers without flinching, and in that silence, he made his decision. He would not yield, not even a little. Taking a breath, he spoke slowly, each word deliberate, so there could be no misunderstanding. "No," he said, "this cabin belongs to me. It is not for your use, not for your guests, and not for any HOA function. I won't unlock this door." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still. The president's carefully constructed facade cracked, the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth betraying her disbelief. No one, at least not in her experience, had ever told her no. She had built her reputation on intimidation cloaked in politeness, on bending neighbors to her will with threats of fines, letters, and rules quoted like scripture. Now, here stood someone unbending, and worse, unapologetic about it. Her voice rose, sharper now, shedding its earlier friendliness. "Excuse me. You will unlock this door," she snapped, the sweetness gone. Her guests murmured behind her, some amused, others shifting uncomfortably. She turned halfway toward them as though to gather support, then spun back to him with renewed fire. "This isn't a request. As president of the HOA, I have authority over all shared resources in this community. Your cabin," she jabbed a finger toward the weathered wooden walls, "falls under that umbrella. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." His jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm, almost too calm, as if he had prepared for this very moment. "You're mistaken. This cabin is not a shared resource. It was purchased by my family long before this HOA ever existed. It does not fall under your authority, and you don't get to claim it because it's convenient." The guests began whispering louder now, some smirking at the spectacle. One of them chuckled, saying just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Looks like someone doesn't know how things work around here." Another muttered, "What's the harm? Just open it and let us enjoy the lake." Their casual entitlement only fueled the tension, but the man didn't so much as glance their way. His focus stayed squarely on the president. Her cheeks flushed with color, whether from anger or embarrassment he couldn't tell. "You think you can talk to me like this? she demanded, her voice carrying a shrill edge that pierced the quiet evening air. I'm the one who enforces the rules here. You keep pushing, and I'll fine you so heavily you'll wish you'd never set foot on this property again. Do you understand me? For the first time, he let the weight of his silence stretch before answering. Then, his voice cut through her bluster with precision. You don't scare me. And your rules don't apply here. My answer isn't changing. The door stays locked. It was a moment of defiance so simple, yet so powerful, that it left her momentarily speechless. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resorted to insults or threats, just an immovable refusal, as solid as the lake itself. To her, it felt like an act of rebellion, a direct challenge to the authority she clung to so desperately. To him, it was nothing more than truth. Her guest stirred restlessly, sensing the escalation. A few shifted back, wary of the storm brewing in her expression. She clenched her fists at her sides, her whole body trembling with the effort of holding herself together. In her mind, this should have been simple. She asked, he complied, her guests were impressed by her influence. Instead, she stood on his porch, humiliated, her authority questioned in front of the very people she wanted to impress. The air thickened, heavy with the clash of wills. He remained where he was, unyielding, his presence alone enough to hold the line. And though she tried to mask it with outrage, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes revealed something deeper. For the first time, the HOA president realized she was up against someone she couldn't bully into submission. Her composure shattered like glass under pressure. The sharp tone in her voice gave way to an outright scream, the kind that drew every sound in the forest to a halt. This is unbelievable, she bellowed, throwing her arms into the air as if the very act of defiance was a personal attack. Her voice echoed over the still lake, scattering birds from nearby branches. She didn't care who heard. In fact, part of her outrage came from the belief that the more witnesses there were, the more her position mattered. The man stood calmly in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the spectacle unfold. He had faced worse storms than this, real storms, not the tantrums of someone who mistook authority for ownership. But the HOA president wasn't simply angry, she was unraveling. You're being disrespectful to me, to the board, and to this community. She shouted, pacing the porch as her guests trailed after her like nervous shadows. I have bent over backward for people in this neighborhood. And this is how I'm treated. You're refusing me. You're refusing the entire association. Her voice cracked on the last words, a shrill note that grated against the peaceful backdrop of the lake. Her guests exchanged glances. A few shifted uncomfortably, as if reconsidering their loyalties. One of them tried to interject, to calm her down, but she whirled on him too, snapping, "Don't you dare tell me to relax. I am the president here. If he thinks he can humiliate me in front of you, he has another thing coming." That was the moment the man, steady and deliberate, slipped his phone from his pocket. With a few taps, the camera was recording. He didn't need to say a word. Her own voice was digging the hole deeper with every furious syllable. The lens caught her wild gestures, her flushed face, the way spit flew from her lips as she screamed about power, authority, and respect owed to her title. You think you're clever, don't you? She snarled when she noticed the phone. She jabbed a finger at him, trembling with rage. You're filming this. Fine. Film it. Everyone will see how unreasonable you are. Everyone will know you refused to cooperate with the community you claim to be part of. Her words tumbled over one another, no longer coherent arguments but frantic accusations. You're selfish. You're ungrateful. You're unfit to live here. The more she spoke, the louder her guests murmured. One shook his head and muttered, "This is too much," while another quietly suggested leaving before things escalated further. But she ignored them all, clinging to her unraveling performance like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. The man didn't rise to her bait. He didn't argue, didn't shout back, didn't even move from his place in the doorway. His silence only made her rage burn hotter. She stomped her foot on the porch like a child denied a toy. "Mark my words," she screeched, her voice hoarse now. "You will regret this. I'll see to it personally. You'll wish you never set foot in this cabin again." But what she didn't realize, what she couldn't realize in the heat of her fury, was that the damage wasn't being done to him. It was being done to her. Every second of her meltdown was captured in crisp detail, every word another nail in the coffin of her own credibility. Neighbors across The lake, drawn by the noise, had already begun to step onto their porches, watching from a distance as the president's authority dissolved into hysterics. By the time she finally stopped to catch her breath, sweat glistening on her brow and her chest heaving, the man still hadn't said a single word beyond his original refusal. His calm contrasted her chaos so starkly that it was clear to everyone who looked unshaken and who looked utterly undone. The president had wanted to make a spectacle that proved her dominance. Instead, she had delivered her own undoing, and the evidence was now in his hands, saved forever in the memory of his phone. The next morning dawned quiet, but the echoes of the previous night's chaos still lingered in the air. Word of the HOA president's outburst had already spread through the community, faster than wildfire on dry brush. Neighbors who hadn't witnessed it firsthand had already heard retellings, each version fueled by the shock of seeing the one person who demanded control completely lose it in public. By the time the man stepped out onto his porch with his coffee, he could feel the eyes of the lakefront community on him, not with suspicion, but with curiosity and, in some cases, quiet approval. He had slept soundly, untroubled by the threats she hurled at him. The video on his phone was enough protection. It wasn't just proof of her unprofessional behavior, it was undeniable evidence that she had crossed a line far beyond her authority. He knew better than to post it online or start a shouting war. That wasn't his way. Instead, he sent the footage directly to the HOA board members, accompanied by a clear and measured statement. The president had trespassed, demanded access to private property, and publicly harassed him when he refused. He didn't need to embellish. The video spoke louder than any accusation could. Within hours, the board called an emergency meeting. Members who had once fallen in line with her commands now faced a decision they couldn't avoid. The recording was damning, her shrill voice echoing in the room as she berated him, threatened fines, and claimed authority she never actually had. The guests who had been with her were contacted as witnesses, and their accounts matched what the video showed. She had lost control, turned a personal whim into a public debacle, and embarrassed the entire association in the process. By the end of the week, her position was untenable. The board, embarrassed by her behavior and fearful of legal repercussions, voted to remove her as president. For years, she had wielded her title like a weapon, issuing fines for grass an inch too high, for decorations deemed unsuitable, for cars parked half a foot over the line. Many neighbors had quietly resented her, but none had dared to challenge her. Now, thanks to one man's refusal and a simple video, her reign had collapsed in a single evening. She didn't take it gracefully. She stormed out of the meeting when the decision was finalized, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Yet there was nothing more she could do. Her power was gone, stripped by her own actions, and no amount of shouting could put it back in her hands. For the man, the fallout was bittersweet. He hadn't sought conflict, hadn't wanted to be the center of community gossip. All he had wanted was peace, a weekend at his cabin, fishing on the lake, reading in the quiet. But in standing firm, he had done more than protect his own sanctuary. He had shown his neighbors that they, too, could say no, that entitlement and authority did not outweigh truth and principle. That weekend, as the sun dipped low and painted the water with streaks of orange and violet, he sat once again on the dock, line cast into the lake. The water rippled, gently, as if nothing had happened, and in a way, nothing had. The cabin still stood, the woods still whispered, and the peace he cherished remained intact. The difference now was that his solitude was secure, not just because he had defended it, but because the very force that had threatened it had crumbled under its own arrogance. The quiet felt different this time. Stronger. Hard-won. As the evening shadows stretched across the lake, he allowed himself a small smile. What began as an intrusion had ended in justice, and though he hadn't sought victory, it had found him all the same.